Hey, Coach Robert here. Today we're going to look at an opening that is considered a really aggressive opening for white. Now, one of the reasons I want to look at this opening is because there's so many tactical possibilities that come out of it. It's not the best opening to play for white, but I'll tell you what, when somebody plays this against me, I get nervous. Mainly because I know it's really hard to defend against and it's really easy to make a mistake if you're playing with black. And it's a lot of fun to play with white because, you've got the tactical opportunities, there's sacrifices involved. So it's fun. A lot of kids play this when they're first starting to play in tournaments because it's got this aggressive aspect to it. You're constantly attacking and you're forcing your opponent to find the way to defend. And so as we go through this opening, I want to show you some of the tactics that can come up. And so we can start learning those too if you haven't already. So remembering our opening principles, the things you want to accomplish in an opening is you want to control the center, you want to develop your pieces, and you want to castle your king. And so because of that, one of the most common moves is e4. e4 puts a pawn in the center. It creates space to develop your bishop and eventually your knight, which would then allow you to castle your king. So that's a really common first move for white. So let's go ahead and play through a couple moves. We'll have black play e5. The knight develops to f3, so you're developing a piece, putting more attacker in the center, and you're attacking black's pawn. So black will often defend with knight c6. Now you can bring the bishop out and finish your kingside development. And you can put that either on b5 or c4. For this opening, we're going to do c4, okay? Now let's say black plays the two knights defense and goes ahead and develops his knight, basically counter-attacking your e4 pawn, saying you need to defend this, and I'm going to get a tempo where I can develop my bishop. Well, here's the opportunity for white to play this really aggressive opening. It's named after everybody's favorite dinner. It is called the fried liver attack. Okay, maybe it's not your favorite dinner. It's not my favorite dinner. But I was teaching it to somebody today and they said, oh, I love fried liver. And I was a little disgusted and distracted from teaching. So the fried liver attack, instead of defending that pawn, you move your knight from f3 to g5. Man, I will tell you, whenever anybody plays knight to g5, I get nervous. Because if you know anything about the scholar's mate, you know that the f7 pawn is black's weak spot. Okay? Now we have a bishop that we decided to put on c4, pointed at the f7 pawn. And we have a knight also pointed at the f7 pawn. And the scary thing is if that knight takes f7, then there is a fork of the queen and the knight and the rook. See how a knight there is going to attack both of those pieces at once, and there's nothing black can do about it because it's defended by the bishop and the king can't take it. So, how does black defend? All right, the right thing to do here is you can't block the knight, so you have to block the bishop. But there's only one piece you can use to block the bishop, and that is your d pawn. I guess you could use the knight over here, but that doesn't seem like a good idea because that would just hang the knight to your pawn. So we're going to block with the d pawn. And it's most common for white to say, okay, well, I can't just ignore that because now my bishop is under attack. White has two attackers on the pawn. It's got the bishop attacking it. Let's see. The bishop is attacking and the pawn is attacking. But black has two defenders, the queen and the knight. So you can't just trade off, but white still can't ignore it because the bishop's under attack. So white will often attack with this pawn. Okay, right here, the most common move for black, if they don't know what they're doing, is to take that pawn with the knight. It said, oh, I had two defenders. I can just go ahead and play as if I'm going to trade some pieces. And so black takes the pawn. And this is where white has a really nasty trick up his sleeve. White goes ahead and takes the pawn on f7 anyways. Now, the knight's not protected like it was before. Before, the bishop was defending the knight, but now it's not. So let's back up here. Right now, Black's knight has walked into a pin on the f7 pawn. Okay. Well, okay, pinning a knight to a pawn doesn't seem like a big deal. But if I put my knight there and the king captures, now that pin is a big deal. See? The knight cannot move because then the bishop would have eyes on the king, and you can never leave your king in danger. So that knight is stuck on d5. So this is a tactic called a pin. This gives white an opportunity to bring out another piece and attack two pieces at once. It's attacking the king and attacking the knight, a double attack. There are now two attackers on the knight, the queen and the bishop, but there's only one defender, the black queen. So a lot of times the black king will then step up to defend the knight, and whenever you have a pinned piece, you want to put as much pressure on that as possible. And so you go ahead and continue your development. And look, white is just bringing pieces out, piece after piece, and it's got this crazy attack going on to the king. Pretty soon you're going to push the d pawn to d4, bring your bishop out probably to g5, unless this pawn is moved, then you might be able to bring it to f4. Castle queenside, get the rooks in the game. Black's king, you remember the point of the opening is to get your king safe. Black's king is in the middle of the board, behind an isolated pawn that you're about to bust open with d4. This is not good for black. Pretty much, it's really hard to defend this position, okay? So, it's a very aggressive opening for white, but it's not the best opening for white. It's not totally sound because there's ways for black to defend it. So let's back up a little bit. So that way, if you ever see it as black, you can see some better ways to defend than what I just showed you here. The key move is right here, that you do not want to take the pawn with the knight. You have really two options. You can play your other knight over to a5, attacking the bishop. So if the bishop retreats, you just trade your knight for the bishop and then pick up the pawn. If the bishop attacks, then you bring your other pawn in and try to drive it off. So that's one option. The other option is to push b5, because that counterattacks the bishop. If the pawn, so let's see how that one would look. All right, so we'll take pawn to b5. White now has two options. White can capture the knight with the pawn, or white can capture the pawn with the bishop. If the pawn captures the knight, then the pawn captures the bishop. Pretty even. We got some isolated pawns, some gross pawn structure, but it's fairly even there. If the bishop captures the pawn, then the knight captures the pawn, and we're okay. So that's one way to play through this. Another way is actually, instead of bringing the pawn to d5, here's a risky move for black, a risky counterattack. So if you want to try this, you can, but be aware it's not a great move. It's kind of risky. Okay. Black plays bishop to c5 and ignores the threat on f7. So this gives white the opportunity to capture on f7, forking the queen and the rook. So fork is where you are attacking two pieces at once, and it looks like your opponent has to give up one or the other. But since you're not forking the king, black can ignore the fork altogether and do his own sacrifice. All right, so black also captures the f-pawn, but captures f2 with check. So the king has to capture back, and you can bring your other knight in and put him in check again. And now the white king is the one that's moving towards the center of the board. The white king's the one that's not castled. And so white now has to play very, very carefully here. So the best move for white at this point is to move to g1, but it's really common for the king to move instead back to e1, because sometimes kids, they want to leave the possibility to bring that rook out. Well, if the king goes to e1, oh man, the white queen is going to be pretty much toast. It's going to be lost. When you play queen to h4 with check, There's no real good defense, but something like maybe G3. That's the best move you have. But here's a really, really cool attack right here. Rook takes G3. Now it may look like, wait a second, but they can just take my knight. Sorry, knight takes G3. They can't take your knight though, because if they take the knight, that leaves the rook hanging. Oh, that's still, if they don't take the knight, well, then the rook's still hanging. Either way, the rook falls. So a lot of times they'll go ahead and take the knight, at least get that piece. But then when you take on H1, you now have a skewer. Okay, we've seen forks, we've seen pins, and now we've seen skewers. The queen is attacking the king. The king has to move, but there's a queen behind the king. So a lot of times the king will try to move and stay close to the queen, but then you can just come in with check, and the king is forced to move away, and the queen is lost. So that's a really nasty counterattack with black. So if you play the fried liver, watch out for this counterattack. If they play bishop to c5 with the threat of taking your f-pawn, make sure that you get your king over to g1 instead of coming back to e1. If you're playing as white, hopefully you can keep up that attack, and maybe black will make a mistake and not some of these counterattacks. But as you can see, these games are really, really attacking, and the evaluation bar just keeps going back and forth. It was all from like +4 for white to now it's like +20 for black. So that's a really fun, aggressive opening. Even if you don't play the fried liver attack, knowing how scary knight to g5 is for your opponent is just handy to know. Said whenever anybody plays knight to g5 against me, my heart starts racing and it's skipping a beat, and I'm thinking, okay, what did I do? How did I mess up? Because now they're attacking my f-pawn. What have I done wrong? So have fun playing with the fried liver and see if you can't use that to sneak in some wins against some opponents that might not know that one yet. And I will see you in the next video.